welcome to the greenhouse. So my name is Deanna Geelhoed and I work for Plaster Creek Stewards here at Calvin University. This is our greenhouse where we grow all of our native plants for watershed restoration. We focus on the Plaster Creek Watershed, but today we're talking about how to make our yards creek friendly so we can restore our waterways no matter where we live. So first, we just did an introduction to the greenhouse for our Creek Friendly Yards talk today. Then we're going to go into the Creek Friendly Yards PowerPoint right after this. That'll give you some information about what watershed you're in, how to care for your waterways, even if you don't live by a creek. And then we'll have a short video explaining how to walk through your yard and decide what you can do to make your yard creek friendly. This presentation is about Creek Friendly Yards, caring for our downstream neighbors with our landscaping by Plaster Creek Stewards. You may be thinking, creek friendly yards? I don't live in a creek, how does this apply to me? Well, I'll show you two reasons how even if you don't live on a creek, you can still help your nearby waterways. The first reason we should care is that we all live in a watershed. What is a watershed? Watershed is the area of land that drains to a common point, either a stream, river, or lake. If you look at this graphic here, you can see when it rains on this landscape, gravity causes the water to flow over land, downstream, or it can soak into the ground and go into the groundwater and enter streams and creeks that way. Wherever we are, we're in a watershed. We're always on land that drains somewhere. By looking at the quality of the waterway that flows through a landscape, we can learn a lot about the way the land is being used. For example, in this photo, when it rains on this sort of landscape, the rainwater is absorbed by trees and plants, and there's probably not a lot of runoff getting to the creek itself. There's some trees, so the creek is shaded and cooled down, as opposed to an example of an urban waterway, where there's not a lot of vegetation, it's out in the open, it gets a lot of heat. Just think about the quality of the water in these two different streams and how they are different. Watersheds can be nested within each other. This is a map of all the lower 48 states of the United States, and we can see some of the larger watersheds delineated here. This should be a familiar photo to you all. If we zoom in and look at Michigan, we can see all the land that surrounds the Great Lakes. This is the Great Lakes Basin. And within the Great Lakes Basin, there's the Lake Superior watershed, Lake Huron watershed, and many other watersheds in this area. This map shows the watersheds that make up the basin of Lake Michigan. It shows some of the major rivers that flow into the lake. These boundaries are made by topography, not necessarily by state lines or counties, and these watersheds have existed for thousands and thousands of years. Here in Grand Rapids, we are part of the Grand River watershed. So that includes the Upper Grand and the Lower Grand. Before development, the lakes and streams in our state flowed through natural landscapes. We can see here on the map that West Michigan area used to be lots of forest, and now it's been urbanized. So let's see how that's impacted our waterways. The biggest threat to our lakes and streams in urban areas today is the runoff they receive. So when you add a lot of pavement, parking lots, roofs, all that sorts of thing, when it rains, that water can't soak into the ground like it could if it was forest. Now that water is drained into drains in the street, like storm drains or drains in the parking lots, and those are all piped to the nearest waterway. So stormwater runoff is what we call that water that just drains right to the creek. And with it, it brings lots of bad things to our water. Okay, so the first reason I said we should care about having a creek-friendly yard is because we're in a watershed. So no matter where we are on land, it drains to some body of water. But the second reason is you actually might live close to a stream and you might not even know it. So here's a map of Grand Rapids. This is taken from a document that the city put out called the Stream Daylighting Opportunities Assessment. What this is showing is all of the watersheds within the city of Grand Rapids. All of them lead to the Grand River at some point. But we can see the fat blue lines here show that the creek is daylighted, so it's above ground. But a lot of the streams, especially in the Creston neighborhood, are actually underground. After the Great Depression, there was this huge need to create jobs and work, especially in the public sector. So Grand Rapids, among many other states in the United States, came up with projects to urbanize and develop cities. So in Grand Rapids, we put a lot of our creeks underground. This is a photo of putting Silver Creek underground. This is a tributary to Plaster Creek, where I do most of my work in that watershed. The natural creeks in our communities were seen as a hindrance to urban development because they would flood, they'd meander, they got in the way of building. So to create jobs after the Great Depression, there was a surge in construction. This involved putting creeks underground in pipes. Here's another picture of Silver Creek where it goes underground. It's underground for about 4 miles before it re-enters or is daylit to Plaster Creek. Things that go in this pipe don't usually make it out alive on the other end. This is the outlet of Silver Creek, where it joins Plaster Creek in the Roosevelt Park neighborhood. Here again is the map of the waterways in Grand Rapids. At the bottom of the map, you can see Silver Creek, the photos we just saw. It goes underground near Hall and Breton, and then continues on into Silver Creek, where it enters around Roosevelt Park. But now looking at the Creston neighborhood, we can see a lot of those kind of skinny blue lines represent creeks that are underground. So most of Carrier Creek, a large portion of Coldbrook Creek, and even some of the other drains in that area are underground. And where they reach the Grand River, that's where their outlet pipe is. Here, this map is a little zoomed in so we can see the street signs a little better. So here is Plainfield Avenue going this way. And here is Leonard here. Just to give you a little bit perspective of where the Carrier Creek watershed is, and then the Palmer Heights drain, it's called, because it's mostly underground. And the Palmer Heights drain enters the Grand River just south of Knapp Street. These creeks are now out of sight and out of mind. It's interesting to think about how people's lives might be different if they had a creek in their neighborhood that they could visit and play in and have more access to nature. At this point, it would be very hard and expensive to daylight a lot of these creeks because they're now on private property, or underneath buildings, underneath homes, things like that. But this is just another example of how we have neglected our urban waterways. It's true that some of them are underground, but even the waterways above ground in our city are in bad shape. Let's introduce some of the main issues in our urban waterways. All of these photos are taken from Plaster Creek, since that's kind of my focus and I know Plaster Creek Watershed the best. But all of these issues apply to every urban waterway. So the biggest issue is the runoff that's getting into these streams, right? And everything it brings with it. So one of the things that it's affected with all this urban runoff is the flow. So this means that the levels raise really quickly. They become flashy after it rains. Because that water isn't soaking into the ground, it's getting put in through all these pipes. So the water levels can go up and down in a matter of moments, which can be really dangerous. The second issue is sediment. So if you've ever seen a creek that's flowing almost like a chocolate milk color, that's what we call turbid. That means it has a lot of dirt and a lot of suspended sediment in the water. When there's so much dirt in the water, it makes it really hard for aquatic life to survive, like fish that need to breathe. And when these creeks rise and fall so quickly, there's a lot of energy in the water. So that kind of cuts away at the banks and causes more erosion. Erosion is when different parts of the land kind of slump off and get into the creek, and there's exposed soil, which kind of just exacerbates the problem. More soil exposed, more soil in the water. Bacteria contamination is an issue. This is something we can't see, but we know is a problem. In Plaster Creek especially, there's a lot of E. coli bacteria. E. coli is found in poop, essentially. And how we know this is we take drops of water and we grow them in these petri dishes here. So if we take a couple drops of water, say like 5 milliliters or something, we put it in the petri dish, we let it grow for a day or two, and then we count these blue dots. Each one of these blue dots represents a colony of E. coli. And then we say, okay, we collected 5 milliliters. Let's say we collected 100 milliliters. This would mean we have 200 colonies of bacteria represented on this plate. And for Michigan, the quality standard for full body contact, which means water that's safe to swim in, is 130 colonies. So Plaster Creek, when we took this sample, was unsafe to swim in. But just 10 days later, in that same spot, we took a water quality sample and grew up the E. coli. But this time, it was right after a rainstorm. This is what the plate looked like. This represents over 24,000 colonies of bacteria. When the water is so high in bacteria, it's unsafe to swim in, unsafe to touch, unsafe to have your dog drink the water from, unsafe to eat the fish from. It becomes a huge public health hazard rather than a benefit to the community. Nutrient pollution is another threat to our waterways. This is when you get a lot of fertilizers and it rains and you get that runoff into the creek and you get a lot of algae. It just kind of disturbs the energy cycles within the creek. Thermal pollution. This is something we don't always talk about or even think about really. This is heat. So there's too much heat in the water. This happens because we've cut down a lot of the trees and things that sheltered our creeks. Also, we've added a lot of hot pavement. So just think about in the summer, you see that asphalt kind of steaming, and we get a thunderstorm that rolls through. All of that rainwater that falls on the asphalt absorbs that heat before it goes down the drain. So then our creeks get a huge sludge of hot water, which can be really stressful for the aquatic life in the creek. Trash and toxic substances, so this is dumping litter, things that wash into the creek that way. So the runoff that's going down the drains and piped into the creeks is causing the issues. So what we want to do is stop the amount of runoff that's getting into the drains. So Plaster Creek, Carrier Creek, Coldbrook Creek, most of the creeks in our city enter the Grand River, and the Grand River flows out to Lake Michigan, which is where we get our drinking water from for the city of Grand Rapids. This is a photo of Grand Haven, where Grand River enters Lake Michigan. Right here is the lighthouse, if you ever walked the pier right there. This is the state park, where lots of people like to go swimming. This photo was taken in April of 2013. If you remember, we had a lot of water, a lot of flooding that spring. So this isn't normal, but it does happen. All of this plume of sediment we see going into the lake really affects the water quality up and down the coast. We have friends at Grand Valley who said they had to take their boats out, 2 miles before they could get a clean water sample that wasn't affected by the Grand River. So this just goes to show again how our watersheds are nested within each other. Our creeks impact the Grand River, which impacts the Lake Michigan. Wendell Berry is a favorite author of mine, and he writes about watersheds in his essays from Watersheds and Commonwealth. He writes this: people who live at the lower ends of watersheds cannot be isolationists or not for long. Pretty soon they will notice that water flows, and that will set them to thinking about the people upstream who either do or do not send their silt and pollutants and garbage. Thinking about the people upstream ought to cause further thinking about the people downstream. Such pondering on the facts of gravity and the fluidity of water shows us that the Golden Rule speaks to a condition of absolute interdependency and obligation. People who live on rivers might rephrase the rule in this way: do unto those downstream as you'd have those upstream do unto you. This quote has always been really inspirational for me and speaks to the work that we do at Plaster Creek Stewards, helping to restore people's relationship to their waterways and learn about how they can care for those people downstream and listen to those upstream. This is a photo taken of Plaster Creek when we had a lot of rain one spring. You can see the creek usually flows back behind that bike trail here. Let me see if I can mark it. Back here, on the other side of that is where the creek flows. But when we get a lot of rain, it kind of overflows its banks because it's getting so much runoff. This is right by 28th Street, actually. So you can see the issues of our urban waterways and the neglect that they receive has huge impacts, especially to people living downstream who get the brunt of the pollution and the brunt of the water coming into their neighborhoods. So what can you do in your yard to help the creek? Well, the first thing is to retain the rain. So this is catching the runoff from your property and letting that water soak into the ground, reducing the amount of runoff and things that can get into the creek. The second thing is to add native plants and trees to your landscaping. So here are the different practices we can do to retain the rain on our properties. So green roofs, that's when you add plants or different things on the rooftop so when it rains on the roof, instead of that water going down the drain or overflowing over land, instead it's absorbed by the plants right there on the roof. Rain barrels. So rain barrels catch the water at the bottom of the downspouts and hold on to it so there isn't a big gush of water during a rain. And then you can use that water later on to water your plants or other things. Porous pavement. So this is a replacement for asphalt or, concrete, things like that on road surfaces. This actually allows the water to flow right through it because it has gaps in the spacing there. So then that water can just soak right into the ground instead of flowing on top of the pavement. And then this is a picture of what we call a buffer garden. So for people that live near creeks, if you can add plants right along the water's edge, that helps hold in the banks. If you do plants with deep roots, that kind of keep it there. And it can catch runoff from the surrounding landscape by kind of acting as a buffer. So those plants absorb that water before it can run off into the creek. So we'll give some more examples of these other things. So all of these things together are called green infrastructure. So this is treating rainwater or stormwater with plants or natural systems instead of pipes, which is called gray infrastructure. So rain barrels, trees, rain gardens, and native plants, those are probably the most likely options for your yard. So the Plaster Creek Watershed kind of begins in a more rural area, Dutton, Caledonia, and then it flows kind of through the southern edge of Grand Rapids and enters the Grand River. But when it begins, it's just kind of ditches, agricultural runoff, things like that. So by planting all these trees, we create a sort of buffer garden to absorb a lot of that water off the fields and to catch that. So that's what this photo is, an example of a buffer garden. Trees are really helpful, not only because their root systems help hold soil in place, and they put channels in the soil for rainwater to infiltrate into the ground, but also in their leaves. So when it's raining and there's a tree that's out in full leaf, it can actually hold gallons and gallons of water just on its leaves. So that much water isn't just gushing, off a parking lot. Instead, it's sitting in the leaves of those trees to either evaporate or slowly flow down the trunk of the tree and into the ground. Trees are really important for managing stormwater and really good for wildlife as well. Rain gardens. So this is kind of our bread and butter type of project with Plaster Creek Stewards. We do lots of rain gardens. So rain garden is a garden shaped like a bowl that catches rainwater and lets it soak into the ground. So if we're looking at this photo, this downspout here on this house, normally that water would kind of flow down the downspout off the roof and then over their lawn grass. And actually the creek would be right behind us in this photo. So it just kind of flow over their grass into the creek. But we intercepted that rainwater with a rain garden. So here's a picture of that. So now that water flows down that downspout, enters this bowl-shaped garden, and the water stays there. So it can slowly soak into the ground, enters the groundwater instead of being runoff that would go into the creek. And the plants that we use in these rain gardens are very important. They're native plants. Here's another picture of a rain garden actually at that same house. So there's two downspouts here and here. So we put in a rain garden just like that to catch the runoff. So the plants used in these projects are native to Michigan. So this means they are used to Michigan cold winters and hot summers, and they're able to survive because they have very, very deep root systems. So the deep roots of these plants are perfect for rain garden projects because they can soak up a lot of water. The roots kind of hold soil in place and prevent erosion. It kind of filters out the excess nutrients, traps sediments when we have these plants in place. Also, because they're used to Michigan climate, they are lower maintenance than lawn. They don't have to be mowed or blowed or fertilized or anything like that, as opposed to lawn grass, which is the photo here in the red circle. That's lawn grass. This is a graph showing the depths of the roots. So lawn grass maybe has like 4-inch deep roots, not super long. It doesn't absorb a lot of water because it has those short roots. If you walked through like soggy spots in the lawn, you'll know that they can't absorb all that water, as opposed to some of these native species here that have roots that can reach, 10 to 12 feet long in just a matter of years. A lot of their biomass is underground. And because these plants are native to the area, they naturally attract birds and butterflies and seed eaters like birds and different sorts of native pollinators. So they kind of act as the grocery stores for our wildlife. Lots of benefits to using native plants. Here you can see some roots on some native sedges. Sedges are similar to grasses, and we grow a lot of different species at Calvin, where Plaster Creek Stewards is housed. But these sedges are actually only a couple weeks old. You can see how deep their roots are. They grow very quickly. We love to use these in projects, especially near the creek. Here are some other native plants. You actually might recognize some of them. There's black-eyed Susans right here, or purple coneflower down in the corner. Little blue stem is this grass. Coreopsis is this yellow one right here. Penstemon or foxglove is this white one. So it's not necessarily a different aesthetic when you're adding these plants to your landscaping, but because they are native, they kind of spread and do their own thing. So they can look as wild or as maintained as you want. It just kind of depends what the aesthetic is for your yard. They don't naturally look wild right away. It just kind of depends how you care for them. There's shorter species, there's taller species, there's lots of grasses or flowers. It's important to kind of think about plants that bloom at all times of the year, not only so your garden is beautiful, but also so the pollinators have access to nectar throughout the whole season. So in addition to planting native plants and trees, adding rain gardens, using rain barrels or green roof, porous pavement, there's some other behavioral changes, things you can do to help protect our creeks. One being shovel and then salt. Adding lots of salt onto the pavements always ends up washing down the drains at some point, and that affects the aquatic life. Having snow melt on grass instead of just piling up in a parking lot. Otherwise, when it melts, you know, it would all go down the drain, but if you put it on grass, at least some of that water can soak into the ground. Wash your car on grass as well, so that water can soak into the ground, or bring your car to a car wash because that water actually gets treated before it's emitted. Using phosphorus-free fertilizer, that reduces the amount of algae blooms that impact the creek. Keeping your grass just a little bit taller, that makes it have a little bit more friction, so when it does rain, it catches a little bit more of that rainwater, that runoff, than if it's really short. Picking up of pet waste and getting rid of it in the trash. So the water that goes down the storm drains, a lot of people think it goes to the sewage treatment plant and is treated, but actually it's not. It's just piped to the nearest underground or above ground waterway. So getting rid of pet waste is a really good way to reduce the E. coli levels in our waterways. Don't feed ducks or geese bread. That gives them diarrhea, which then increases the E. coli in the water. Only putting stormwater down the catch basins. Like I said, that water isn't treated, so you don't want to ever pour paints or chemicals or anything that you're trying to dump down the catch basins, because that all just goes right to the Grand River. And riding the city bus or rideshare, that one's a little bit kind of disconnected from our waterways, but what it's saying is actually our cars kind of have a lot of rubber and brake dust and things that come off the cars that get into the streets. So by reducing the amount of cars on the road, it actually less chemicals and oil and stuff runs off the streets when it rains. So less of that is going down the drains into the creek. All right, that's it for the presentation. Thank you for listening to how to make your yards more creek friendly. Hopefully it wasn't too clunky doing it online as opposed to in person. But now we're going to transition in the video to going outside and looking at our yards to help decide which practices work best on our properties. Thank you. All right, I hope you enjoyed that River Team PowerPoint about different things you could do in your yard, learning about creek-friendly yards and all that good stuff. So now we're actually out in the field where we can walk through a property and figure out what practices are best. So here is a field house owned by Calvin College. We have different offices and kind of field station equipment here. So we're just going to walk through the different practices. So first let's talk about trees and how to pick out trees. So one thing we want to be mindful is what's underground. So we can tell here that there's an electric line probably running from the house to this lamppost. So that gives us an idea that there's probably an electric line underground in that area. But you can figure this out by calling MISDIG. MISDIG is a program in Grand Rapids, 311. You can call them, or you can go online, kind of put in your address and information, and they'll come out and mark your utilities. That way you know where your electric and your cable and your optic and all those lines are. So you can be mindful of where to plant your trees to avoid those sorts of things. Another thing to consider when selecting a tree species for your yard, you want to think about visibility a little bit. So this property is actually right on a busy road. So we plant a lot of coniferous trees. So it kind of blocks some of that sound, acts as like a buffer. But as you you know, if you're living right on a street corner or something like that, you don't want to block visibility of cars, things like that. So you want to keep in mind different heights. Some trees grow taller than others, you know, like your hardwoods, like your maples and your oaks and things like that can get really tall. So some shorter species that you could do are, you know, redbuds, serviceberries, juneberries, things like that. Another thing you want to be mindful of is where the water flows on your property. So thinking about the topography of your yard. So here we kind of see, because there's no gutters on this house, there's some runoff and it makes kind of like a swale here, so a lower area, and the water flows this way out to this tree. So being mindful of what areas in your yard are soggy and what areas are drier will help you decide what sort of tree species to select. Another thing you want to be mindful of is the soil type. So if you have sandier soils or heavy clay soils, that will impact the survivorship of the specific tree species. Another thing you want to think about is if you have a septic field. Septic fields, you can't really tell where they are sometimes, but you don't want to plant a tree on top of one because then those roots can mess up those systems. So you want to make sure you're not planting on a septic field. So another thing we want to think about is what's above ground. So we talked about knowing what's below, but we want to know what's above ground. So that would be being mindful of different wires and things. So here at this house we have some lines running up there. So you definitely wouldn't want to plant any big trees right under those wires. So those are some tips for selecting trees. Alright, so let's chat about rain gardens. Rain gardens are kind of the bread and butter of my work, so I love to work with them. A rain garden is a garden that's shaped kind of like a bowl that catches rainwater. It has like a shallow depression and an inlet where the water can go into, and then it's planted with native plants. So places in your yard you could put a rain garden are low areas. If they're already soggy, that usually means that it's heavy soil, like a clay soil. So a rain garden won't necessarily solve that problem, but the lower areas of your yard catch probably the most water. Another area you can do a rain garden is at the bottom of your downspouts. So right here we have gutters running along the house, and then a downspout that comes down, and then you want to extend the downspout about 10 feet from the foundation at least. That way there's not a big pool of water happening right by your home. So for this, there's not a rain garden here right now, but we would dig it out, kind of however much of the space we wanted to use for the rain garden. You can do some calculations. There's calculators online looking at the square footage of your roof and then figuring out the square footage of how big the rain garden needs to be. Here, I know for a fact that the soils are very heavy. So we did a soil core. It's important to look at your soil before you're doing this. So this is a lot of clay soil, which means the water doesn't soak in as quickly. So when we're doing rain gardens in clay soil, you want to dig them deep, add a lot of compost, and also make them pretty large so there's a lot of surface area for that water to soak into the ground. Because anytime you can add native plants, those roots are really good at creating channels in those clay soils for the water to percolate, as well as adding more biodiversity to your yard. So that's rain gardens. The next thing is adding native plants to your landscape. So there's not a lot of kind of things or restrictions on this. You can kind of put native plants anywhere you want. Anywhere in your yard where you feel like you have unused lawn, or areas that you don't want to mow, or you know the kids don't play in those areas or anything. All you have to do is kind of kill the grass, either smother it or use some sort of herbicide or something, and then you know, add some mulch or compost if needed, and then plant with native plants. If you need help with making designs or things like that, there's a group in Grand Rapids called the Native Plant Guild. You can look on their website, just search Native Plant Guild, and they have designers and growers and different people listed there as a resource for you. So when selecting plants for your native plantings or your rain gardens, you want to kind of think about the different bloom times. So the earlier you can get something to bloom, like April and May, that's really helpful for the pollinators. And having something that's blooming at all times of the year, besides winter of course, is really good for the pollinators and the native pollinators in our communities. It's kind of a way to welcome nature back into our urban spaces. You also want to think about the different heights of your plants. If you're planting in your parkway right next to the road in Grand Rapids, you have to keep it below 24 inches, so you want to use kind of shorter species. In your yard, you know, you're kind of free to do whatever you want. There's native plants that I've seen that can get, you know, up to like 12 feet tall, and those are kind of fun to play around with the different heights. Alright, so the last practice we're going to talk about is rain barrels. Rain barrels catch water from the downspouts and hold it in the barrel, which keeps the water from gushing, you know, down the drains and stuff during a storm event. And then you can reuse this water in different areas of your yard. So if we imagine that there was gutters on this side of the house, there's not, because a lot of that water just runs off into this native planting here and is absorbed. But if it had gutters, the downspout would be right about here. And if we wanted to rain garden, we could. It's kind of close to the house, and they're surrounded by a lot of asphalt. So really the rain barrel would be the best option here. So the downspout would connect to the inlet of the rain barrel. Here, you can come closer and see. This is the inlet of the rain barrel. And you usually want to put like a screen or something over it to, you know, keep out debris, reduce mosquitoes, things like that. And then there's also an outlet here at the bottom where you can connect a hose or something to. If you elevate the rain barrels up, that creates more, you know, water pressure. So your rain barrel fills up during a rainstorm. There's also an outlet in case it overflows if you get too much rainwater. And you can direct, like put a hose on this and direct it somewhere. But that's a rain barrel. They're pretty self-explanatory. You can keep an eye for West Michigan Environmental Action Council in Grand Rapids. They have rain barrel workshops once in a while. So that's one place to get rain barrels. You can also buy them online. If you're buying just a random barrel, you want to think about what was in that before. Usually food grade is best. And you want to take these inside during the winter. That's some of the maintenance with them. You want to clean them out, take them inside so they don't crack when they freeze. Scrub them out once in a while. But they're a good option if you have an area of your yard that you want to water using the rainwater. Depending on your roof, especially if it's shingles, I wouldn't recommend using that water on vegetables, just because some of the arsenic and stuff in the shingles can run off into the water, and then we don't really know the health effects, but that's probably not the best idea for putting on your veggies. So that's kind of some of the maintenance with rain barrels. Maintenance with trees, pruning once in a while is helpful. And there's not much else with trees. They're they do their own thing. They're helpful. With native plantings and rain gardens, you don't have to cut down the materials at the end of the season. In fact, if you leave it up during the winter, a lot of pollinators and things will actually go into those stems and hibernate in there. So it's good to leave up some of those dead stalks and things until spring, and then you can clear them out once the bugs and things have left. You don't need to fertilize or mow or blow, the same with lawn, but there's some weeding, especially once the plants are getting established. You want to water and weed them so they can become healthy. But once it fills out, then there's a lot less maintenance with native plantings and rain gardens. So hopefully you found that walk through the yard a little bit helpful in deciding what practices to do in your yard. I wanted to quick show you one last thing. This is a native sedge. Its color is kind of faded now, but it was only a couple weeks old and its roots were already this long. So this just kind of shows how great native plants are for absorbing water, holding in soil, and adding biodiversity to our urban spaces. So thank you for being interested in having a creek-friendly yard. Big thanks to the Living Green Committee in the Crested neighborhood. I encourage you to get involved. They do lots of great work caring about native plants and biodiversity in the Creston neighborhood. You can check them out at their Facebook page. Thank you.